in my office, and you may hear some background noises. I hope not. But if you do, it's just trucks and cars passing my office window. I'm at street level in Washington, D.C., like that. A big truck just went by. And I hope that I'm not interrupted, because my office is does have doors that my colleagues in the office sometimes go through to reach storage rooms and so on. So I will try not to be distracted if anybody comes in. And as you may or may not know how this works, I see questions at the bottom of the page that are passed along to me by the moderators, and I will answer them out loud, but I'm reading them. So I may get some questions coming through that I don't see for a couple of minutes as I'm presenting my talk. So please understand if there's some delay in responding to your questions. All right, it's 1 o'clock, so I'm going to get started. My name is Naomi Rose. I work for the Animal Welfare Institute, which, if you can see the slides, that should show up. The slide actually says November 2015, which is when I prepared this talk, but it's February 2016, so hello, everybody. I am a marine mammal biologist. I studied orcas, killer whales, in the wild for my dissertation, for my Ph.D. So that's the species I know the most about, and I'm going to talk about them in terms of their welfare in captivity today. So this is really an animal welfare lecture, but there are elements in it that relate to conservation, and I hope to be able to raise those points with you. And those conservation points, of course, this is a biodiversity series, so orcas are the ocean's top predator, so they actually have a lot of impact on the rest of the ecosystem. So preserving them, conserving them, protecting them is really important. So the title of my talk is Beneath the Surface, the Impact of Captivity on the Welfare of Orcas. And a lot of you are aware of the situation through the film Blackfish, which I will mention. This is a documentary that was released a couple of years ago now, and has had so much impact on the dialogue and debate about the welfare of captive cetaceans that its impact has been termed the Blackfish effect. And it's really been a remarkable couple of years from my perspective. I've been addressing the issue of the welfare of these animals for the last 23 years. And so to see so much progress being made in the United States in the last 2 years has really been remarkable for me. So next slide. Here we go. So there are 57 orcas on display in 8 countries. And as you can see, 25 of those whales, actually now it's 24. And again, I prepared this talk a few months ago, and there's been an update. There's only 24 now in captivity in the United States, 23 at SeaWorld facilities and 1 at the Miami Sea Aquarium. The reason there's 1 less is because a whale named Una died at SeaWorld San Antonio not too long ago. But as you can see, it says there's 7 in China, and in fact we believe there's 9 now, but we aren't really sure how many of them are still alive. And Russia actually probably has only 4 still in the country, since there are believed to be 9 in China. So the records in China and Russia are very poor. Record keeping is very poor. So we don't actually know how many orcas have been captured from Russian waters and have been distributed between Russian and Chinese facilities. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But we know that there are 7 in Japan, 6 in Spain, and so on. There were 5 in France, and unfortunately, Valentin, a young, a middle-aged male actually, for a captive whale, died after there were some very serious storms in France. So there's only 4 there now. Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm going to talk a little bit about their welfare. And I'm going to approach this through looking at free-ranging versus captive animals. And I hope that by describing the way things are for animals in the wild, that I can demonstrate for you why confining them into such a small space as a tank is really not in their best interest. So the first thing is space. These are amongst the most wide-ranging mammals on the planet, let alone in the ocean. And so the idea of confining them into a tank is really quite remarkably problematic. This is Lolita. She's a lone orca who's held in a facility in Miami, here in the United States. This tank arguably is not legal according to our standards, but our standards are so poor that this facility has been able to, quote unquote, get away with maintaining her in this small space for 40 plus years. Lolita has survived in this very small space for decades, but another whale that used to live with her named Hugo died very long ago in 1980, and that's because Hugo was apparently suffering from a brain aneurysm, and he smashed himself against the walls of this tank until he died. And quite frankly, the size of this tank probably didn't help him coping with that problem. Lolita, as you can see, is almost long enough to actually, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the width of this enclosure is really only about twice her length. So that is considered humane by US standards, which is really rather ridiculous. I have a question here about if I have any thoughts on GMO salmon. To be honest, I consider that to be a bit of a tangent to what I'm trying to talk about here. The problem with farmed salmon is very serious. It's having a serious impact on the wild, free-ranging salmon, and which are, many runs are endangered, particularly in our Pacific Northwest. So messing with prey species for any predator and actually farming them within the habitat of the native prey species is going to be a problem for the predators as well as the prey. So yes, those are my thoughts, but quite frankly, that is an issue that is an entirely separate lecture could be addressed to that issue. So that's all I'll have to say about that. Considering Lolita, looking at her and specifically, somebody's asking if they'll ever release her. I'm not sure she's a good candidate for release anymore. She's 50 years old, and she's been living in that box, in that small space, for 40 plus years. So the idea that she could return to the wild is a bit romantic. I'm hoping that she can be retired to a sea pen sanctuary. I'm hoping all of the whales that are currently being held in captivity around the world can be at least retired to sea pen sanctuaries. And I think all of the recently captured orcas in Russia are very good candidates for return to the wild. But we really need to be careful about Lolita and make sure that her welfare is adequately safeguarded. Somebody's asking me about the blackfish, and I will say, and I think I can answer that question later. The film was very good, and I'm sure you've heard SeaWorld's response to it was that it was lies and that it was propaganda and not a documentary. The only party who really holds that opinion is SeaWorld, and you can sort of understand why they would think that. They felt very defensive after that film came out. But the fact is that the information presented in Blackfish is factual. It may have been from the perspective of the filmmaker, and that's always the case with any documentary, but in fact, the information is factual. So moving on to the next slide. So this is, as I said, an example of a legal facility in the United States. But here is a very good graphic which was developed by an activist on the West Coast, and he obviously got some of these data that are presented here from a research collective on the West Coast, and you can see the problem. So this yellow line, again, I hope you can see the cursor, but the yellow line is the track of a tagged orca from the southern resident killer whale population in Puget Sound. So this is a K33. He was tagged, and he was tracked with in this pattern. He went down to over 600 feet. He messed around on the bottom a little bit, and then he came back up, and his horizontal distance was from here to here, which I can't actually tell from this graphic what that horizontal distance was, but I believe it was on the order of several kilometers. So he traveled that distance in 6 hours. This is a track of a tagged whale over the course of 6 hours. And yet this little box here, this little circle with this little rectangular box here, is the enclosure at SeaWorld, the current Shamu Stadium complex. Look at the difference. This is one of the largest enclosures in the world for, I believe, at any one time, up to 4 to 5 orcas are held in that enclosure. SeaWorld in Orlando has 7 whales. There are 5 in San Antonio, and then there are 11 in San Diego. And they are never all held in the performance area at once, except sometimes during the performance. But they do hold more than, about, as I said, about 4, 5, 6 whales at once in this space. And yet this is one whale in 6 hours, just an average everyday dive that he took. There's something very wrong when it is considered humane for a typical tank to be 1/10,000% the size of the natural home range of these animals. So, and again, this is just one dive. This space is, obviously also just a fraction of this larger box, which is the amount of the volume of space that this whale covered in 6 hours. So we have a real problem here. As I said, large animal with a very large home range, small enclosure. Somebody's asking about new legislation and also USDA regulations. I'm going to get to that at the end. Please bring it up again if I don't, but I intend to circle back to that because it is an extremely exciting time. So free-ranging versus captive animals, social groupings. Again, what's different about them? We believe that orcas are amongst the most closely bonded to family bonded mammals in the world. Okay, again, out of all ecosystems, globally, we believe that orcas are the most tightly bonded to family, even more so than we are. And we, of course, maintain family bonds for life. Well, so do they. But they don't just, move out at 18 and go to college. They stay with their mothers for their whole lives. So this is Kiska, who is held in Canada. She, again, like Lolita, is a lone orca. Again, holding a highly social creature like orcas in solitary is also legal in the United States and a lot of different countries. In the U.S., you have to hold another cetacean with it. So Lolita actually has other dolphins in the tank with her. Kiska doesn't even have that. She is completely alone. And it's because when they tried to put other cetaceans in there with her, she was very aggressive towards them, and so they were in danger, so they moved them back out. I don't even know what her mental state is, living all alone as she does, but I don't think it's healthy. And basically, in general, as you heard in the film Blackfish, for example, calves are frequently removed from their mothers for husbandry purposes. They're moved around for management and husbandry purposes, not because it's normal. As I said, the offspring remain with their mothers throughout their lives. It's not because they are for their own safety. The mother wasn't attacking them. Nobody else was attacking them. It's because they're disruptive. They go through the terrible twos just like people do. They go through the disruptive teenage years. They become disruptive if they're allowed to remain with their mother. And so, and in the wild, they do too. And in fact, there's a lot of typical rambunctiousness in young orcas in the family group. But that's normal. It's handled normally with familial interactions. And unfortunately, in captivity, because the space is so small, the only way they can deal with it is to take the calf out of the picture and move it to another facility where it won't have its mother to protect it. I mean, just hearing that should tell you why that's really wrong. And it does traumatize both the calves and the mothers tremendously. Environmental quality and complexity. Well, this is a typical tank. This is at SeaWorld in Orlando. This is, in fact, the tank where Dawn Brancho was killed in February of 2010, the trainer who was killed by Tilikum, depicted in the film Blackfish. That entire incident happened in this tank, not just at this facility, but in this particular tank. At the time, this tank had some artificial rock features, which gave the tank a little bit more texture for the whales, and it was landscaped above ground for the sake of the human beings who were watching the whales. But after after Tilikum killed Dawn Brancho, they took all of that out. It was all fake. It was all artificial. And it was all easily removed in order to put in a false floor, a fast rising floor that they believed would protect trainers who were in the water with the whales. But they've just made an announcement that they are going to remove that floor. It cost millions of dollars to install it, and now they're actually removing it only a few years later because, in fact, it didn't function as it should. It wasn't really protecting anybody. This is very common. This is a swimming pool with, as you see, pale blue painted walls. It's highly reflective of light. It stays clear all the way to the bottom so people can see the animals when they're in the underwater viewing area. That's not natural. That's not healthy for them. In fact, they get overexposed to sunlight as a result of that. So this is actually a really barren enclosure. And these are incredibly intelligent social animals. So they are being deprived, sensory deprived, by being forced to live in these enclosures. This is a side view of the proposed new enclosure at SeaWorld San Diego. Some of you, especially if you're out in California, will have heard about this. This is Blue World. This is a proposed expansion of the Shamu Stadium complex. And these are part of the architectural plans that are on file at the California Coastal Commission. This is going to be, if it's ever built, a much deeper enclosure to the current Shamu Stadium, which at its maximum depth is 30 feet. Blue World would be 50 feet. And it would be wider. At its maximum width, Shamu Stadium is about 135 feet, I believe, wide. This would be 350 feet wide. And that's great in a sense. They're going to give these animals more space, but it turns out one of the reasons they wanted to give them more space was because they wanted to breed more whales. So if you give them more space, but fill that space up with more animals, then you've actually not changed anything per whale in terms of how much space they have. But the reason I included this cutaway is because you can see here, and again, I hope you can see the cursor, but if you can't, on the right-hand side of each of these cutaways, you see trees. And you may see on the left-hand side of the lower cutaways more trees. And there's also some rock features in the third cutaway. There's some rock features inside the enclosure. Those are all for aesthetics. It's to look like nature, to make it look natural. But if you notice, the vast majority of these architectural features that are put in there for texture and aesthetics are for the people. They're for the people who view the whales. They're not actually for the whales. There's only a little bit of rock feature put into this tank. The rest of it, all this beautiful trees and all of that, that's for people above the water surface. I find that very telling, and it's also very common. A lot of the times when there is landscaping, it's actually because they want to make it look nice for the human viewer, but the whale doesn't gain any advantage from that. And finally, we have behavioral restrictions, predator-prey relations. This is, as I told you at the beginning, this is the ocean's top predator. I often get questions from especially younger kids who ask, in a fight between a great white shark and a killer whale, who would win? The killer whale every time. The orca would win every time because although both of them are top predators, orca has a brain, a really sophisticated ability to strategize and to look into the future and determine what the cause and effect will be. Seriously, that's how smart they are. Whereas sharks, who are magnificent creatures, and I urge everyone to give them a very kind thought. They're very important to the ocean ecosystem. They don't have much of a brain. They are, as far as fish go, very ancient. They were amongst the first to evolve, and they don't have much of a thinking process. They're very instinctual in everything they do. And so when it comes to a showdown between a great white shark and a killer whale, and there's actually been observed some interactions between these two top predators, the orca wins. So here's what you've got. You've got a top marine predator. Here's what they do in the wild. They work cooperatively. They also have this incredible intelligence that allows them to strategize and approach hunting from a very sophisticated point of view. And they hunt differently depending on their environment. They have culture. They teach their young how to forage and hunt in one habitat versus another. And for one prey species, as you notice on the left, it's a sea lion, and on the right, it's a Dall's porpoise. But this is what they get in captivity. Dead fish dropped right into their gullet. They don't even touch the teeth or touch the mouth of the animal. The fish just got dropped right down into their gullet. Sometimes they'll drop a dead fish into the water and the whale will go get it, but that's about as much as hunting behavior as they get to exercise. It's a very big problem for them because in the wild, hunting is their job. It's what they do for a living. And they spend a lot of time doing it. Absolutely. That's not a bad thing. That's like having a job. You want to have a job. You want it to be challenging. You want to be kept occupied in your life. Well, in captivity, because that's taken away from them, they do end up spending a lot of time doing nothing, not being trained, not performing, not really doing anything. And that's a problem. Boredom is actually a really big psychological problem. And I would say the number one downside for this highly intelligent animal to being in such a barren, captive environment is boredom. And that might sound like not so bad to you, but boredom can cause depression, and depression can kill. I have another question about, are there any regulations on the size of an enclosure for any specific animal? I'm going to tell you now what the regulations are. This is the legal size for an enclosure for orcas in the United States. But I'm going to get back to this later when I talk about the new proposal to update the regulations for care and maintenance of captive marine mammals. The legal requirement for space for an orca in the United States is you have to provide them with an enclosure, a tank or a sea pen, that is at a minimum twice as wide as the animal is long on average. So in other words, 24 feet is the average length of an orca. The tank only needs to be 48 feet wide. And it only needs to be 12 feet deep, half the length of an average orca deep. That's a legal tank. And that is, in fact, in many ways, Lolita's tank. Minimum width, in fact, is less than 48 feet for Lolita's tank. And that's what I said about how arguably it's not a legal enclosure. But the Miami Seaquarium has, quote unquote, gotten away with keeping her in that enclosure for 40 plus years for a lot of complicated reasons. It is 20 feet deep, but she is about 21 feet long. And so, in fact, she cannot orient fully in a vertical position. She cannot hang vertically in the water fully. Her tail actually rubs the bottom. And in a legal tank, it's only 12 feet. Of course, an orca could not orient fully in the vertical position. That cannot be considered humane, and yet it is. So again, you can see the problem we're facing here. I'm going to get to the question. I've just been asked a question about how important apex predators are in the ocean. I'm going to just try that actually as quickly as I can here, because I think it's a really good point. So any ecosystem, whether it's on land or in the ocean, is made up of various levels. Okay, so you've got the primary producers, which are herbivore plants. Sorry, they grow and they only need sunlight and water, and they grow and they feed the herbivores, who are then prey for the carnivores. And so it's much more complicated than that. But you know, these are the basic layers of any food web. When you get to the carnivores at the top, they are controlling everything at the bottom, right? They are controlling how many herbivores there are. And the herbivores then in turn control what plants do. And so obviously the top of this food chain, if you will, or you know, a food pyramid, if you will, is extremely important in terms of controlling everything underneath. If you take away that apex predator, that top predator, you end up with too many of, for example, too many herbivores. You get an overpopulation of, for example, in a lot of places around the United States, white-tailed deer. Lovely animals. When they're held in check, they do their job in an ecosystem. But when you take away their predators like wolves or grizzly bears or cougars, when you take away those animals, which we've done in very many places, then they overpopulate, and we get the situation where people hit them with their cars, or they absolutely strip certain areas bare of vegetation during the winter, or we need to hunt them, which in many ways is cruel. But without natural predators, what do we do? So it becomes an extremely messy situation when we take away these apex predators. I hope that makes sense to folks. Now, here's a photo, as I said I was going to provide, of an orca herding fish in Norway. This is a very complex and complicated herding, foraging behavior. They work cooperatively to get all of the herring in this school into what they call a herring ball. And then they take turns going through it to stun the fish with their tails, and then everybody gets to feed on all of the stunned fish. This is a family affair. Now, this is what happens in captivity. Again, just a bunch of dead fish thrown right down into the whale's gullet. Again, this is not a favor to them, which is how the industry likes to present it. They like to say we take away the need for them to forage, which is a lot of their, time is spent foraging, and we give them the privilege and the leisure time to do other things by feeding them. But in fact, again, it's like having a job. When you don't have a job that challenges you, believe me, when all of you students grow up and enter the working world, if you don't have a job that you like and challenges you, get bored, you get restless, you get unhappy. Not having a good job is actually a #1 source of depression in a lot of people. So these whales do not have a good job. They are not doing what they have been evolved and adapted to do. They have had that taken away from them. That is not a plus, that's a minus. So somebody asked, who came up with the regulation to have such small space be legal? Well, that's the government. The government comes up with that regulation. Now, the nice thing about it is we are a democracy. We have the ability as U.S. citizens to have input into what the government does. And so this is when they come up with new regulations, which they have just done, we can have input, and we will have input into the process of trying to improve these regulations. In other countries, it's almost always the government that comes up with these standards, but sometimes it's just the industry itself, self-policing, because the government doesn't really have any law that allows them to have jurisdiction over captive marine mammals. In those situations, that's very bad. That's the fox guarding the chicken coop, as the saying goes. Obviously, there's a huge conflict of interest for an industry to self-police itself. Somebody asks whether there are places with larger tanks. Well, almost all of the tanks are larger. The one I pointed out that is, in fact, not even at the standard is Miami Seaquarium in Florida. SeaWorld's enclosures for its killer whales are much larger than that. The enclosure I showed in the graphic earlier on, where a K33 had that wonderful dive profile, going down to 600 feet and all of that, with the little rectangular box in the upper corner, there representing SeaWorld's Shamu Stadium. Shamu Stadium is much larger. Like I told you, it's 135 feet across and 30 feet deep. I actually mentioned that earlier. So it's much larger than 48 feet wide and 12 feet deep. But given that dive profile you saw for K33, even 135 feet and 30 feet deep, 135 feet wide and 30 feet deep isn't big enough. Even 50 feet deep and 350 feet wide, which is what Blue World would be, this proposed expansion of Shamu Stadium that SeaWorld is proposing, wouldn't be big enough. The problem is that we cannot provide adequately for this incredibly wide-ranging animal in captivity. That's it in a nutshell. This is why their welfare suffers. Somebody's asking if they can't dive or forage, does this affect them in terms of their heart function? Well, it affects them in all ways. Think about it in human terms. When we become couch potatoes, and I urge all of you not to allow that to happen to you, if you become a couch potato and you don't exercise, what is it that your doctor always tells you? Eat less and exercise more. That's what you need to do to stay healthy. You need to be active. We evolved to be hunter-gatherers. We were, in fact, always outside, always looking for food. Again, that was our occupation. When we developed agriculture, we were out there growing our food and raising our food. That was our occupation. Now we do things that are less directly related to our survival by far, and so we have a lot of what is for humans a positive leisure time. We have leisure time. But what do we do during that leisure time? Well, if we just sit around and watch TV, what happens to us? We get sick. We get heart problems, blood pressure problems, diabetes. Any number of things happen to us purely as a result of not being active enough. That is exactly what's going to happen to these animals. If they're not active enough, the way evolution has adapted them to be, then they're going to suffer physical health problems. Somebody's asking about progress in getting these orcas freed. Again, freedom is a concept I want you all to think about very carefully. A lot of these animals are old and have been in captivity for a long time. And by old, I don't mean old in the wild, which is 80 to 90 years. I mean old in captivity, which is 40 to 50 years. Notice how that's half a lifespan, but that's old in captivity. And so a lot of these animals that we're talking about are old. They are in the 40s and 50s. I don't think they're good candidates for release. The younger animals were born in captivity. That makes them not very good wild whales because they've never been wild. And then the ones that have been captured recently, I think those animals are good candidates for release. What I'm talking about is retiring them to sea pen sanctuaries. And we are making a lot of progress in that regard, and I will discuss that later. Finally, another problem that they face is neurotic behavior that they exhibit because they're bored, because they are in such small enclosures. So this is the teeth of a Pacific Northwest whale, and the whale looks so bad, all of this skin problem, because the animal, I'm sorry to say, is dead. This was a photograph taken of a stranded whale, but you can see that the teeth are these nice, conical, cone-shaped, sharp, pointy teeth. That's what's normal. This is what teeth should look like in a typical killer whale. This is what they look like in captivity. Notice on the upper photograph, they're worn right down to the gums. This is actually Tilikum's teeth, the whale that killed his trainer, Don Brancho. These are actually his teeth. He's rubbed them, worn them, ground them right down to his gum line. How does he do that? He chews on the walls of his tank. He chews on the concrete and the metal gates of his tank. And he just rubs and rubs and rubs. This is a very neurotic behavior. It's very bad behavior. It's problematic. Now look at the bottom photograph is another whale whose teeth look a little bit better than Tilikum's, but notice how in the near the front of the mouth, they're broken off. They're actually broken. No whale breaks its teeth in the wild. There are some whales that wear their teeth down for various reasons, but they don't break them. Breakage is a problem of captivity. You can also see that the teeth have holes in them. Well, those are drilled out holes. They've actually done some dental work on these animals, drilled out the pulp, and then have to flush them with water every day to keep them from becoming impacted with food and infected. Bad teeth equals bad health. That's true for people, for your cat, for your dog, for your horses, for any domesticated animal, and for wildlife too. Bad teeth equals bad health. Somebody's asking me, does the captivity of the orca affect the psychological state of the orca? Yes, absolutely. Again, I just said this chewing on the walls is highly neurotic behavior, so absolutely. Being in a confined space, not being able to exercise natural behaviors, results in neurosis, results in some cases, quite potentially, psychosis. And so why do they attack their trainers? I think they're just frustrated. I don't think they're mad or insane or anything like that. I think they just act out through frustration. And what they act out with is, of course, all of the tools that a top predator of the marine environment has. Teeth, jaws, tail. These are animals that can kill very easily. They might not even mean to, but they can. They certainly injure with fair regularity. They've only killed, and I say only, killed 4 people in captivity. But there are no records anywhere in the natural world, in history, of an orca killing a human being. That might strike you as rather odd because they're known as killer whales. But they're called killer whales because they kill whales and seals and sea lions and fish. They're good predators, so they're called killer whales. But they actually have never been recorded throughout history killing a human being. Great white sharks have killed people. Other sharks have killed people. Hippopotamus in Africa have killed a lot of people. They're actually the most dangerous animal in Africa. Hippopotamus, not, tigers, lions, or bears. So all of these species have killed people in nature, in the wild. Orcas have not. They're so smart, they know that we are not prey. So they actually avoid us in the wild. But when they're put into close proximity with us in captivity, with trainers who used to actually swim with them in their tanks, every once in a while they act out in frustration. This is not hunting instinct kicking in. Remember, these are intelligent animals who learn how to hunt from their pod mates, and they are cultural. They actually learn different hunting methods depending on the prey they see. And so they are not going to just suddenly have a hunting instinct kick in and attack their trainer for that reason. The reason they attack their trainers is because they're frustrated and they're acting out at some level. I don't know why, I don't understand what they're thinking, but they are acting out in some way. And unfortunately, because we're just fragile human beings, we break when a killer whale or an orca attacks us. So it's just not a good idea to get that close to an orca. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about longevity, because you will probably have heard this argument. And again, the criticisms against blackfish include this idea that it's not true that they live that long in the wild, but they do. All right. So in this year, last year, recently, 2 authors wrote a paper where they noted that the survival to age milestones is poor in captivity compared to the wild. And by poor, and by milestones, I mean age at sexual maturity and age at menopause. Unlike most mammals who breed up until they die, in fact, orcas are more like we are. We actually females go through a period around the same age, 35, 40, 45 years old, where they stop reproducing and they continue to survive into 80, 90. Why? Because they have value to the social group. They know things. They have great memories. They can convey status onto their offspring. So if they are high in the hierarchy, then their offspring are high in the hierarchy, and so they have more grandchildren because they survive longer. So the percentage of animals that survive to these milestones in the wild is very high. Look at that. 81% make it to sexual maturity in the Pacific Northwest. Only 45% make it to menopause, but that's almost half of females will make it to menopause. That's pretty good. Again, remember, that's about 45 years old. In captivity, only 46% make it to sexual maturity. That's actually a very bad statistic. Okay, that's a very small number of animals making it to sexual maturity. And only 7% so far have made it to menopause. So there's something very wrong just from that data alone. You can see that there's something very wrong going on in captivity. But then there was another paper published, but also in the same, just recently, and these authors were actually from the zoo community. So the first two authors were actually from, if you will, the anti-captivity community, and the second set of authors were from the pro-captivity community. And so if you want to see bias in their results, you can, but I think both papers, did their best to be unbiased. But the second paper actually concluded that their whales at SeaWorld survive just as well as whales in the wild. But the whales they compared them to in the wild were an endangered and threatened stock. So in fact, they conducted their science using established mechanisms, established analyses, but their result was actually very bad for them, and they tried to spin it so it wasn't in their discussion. It actually showed that captivity is as bad for orcas as degraded habitat in the Pacific Northwest, where we've got pollution and serious food problems, food shortages. Salmon, as somebody pointed out, GMO salmon are harming the prey base for killer whales in the Pacific Northwest. And so we've got a situation where there are now data showing that captivity is as bad for killer whales as degraded habitat. It's the same. It's equivalent. It has the same survivorship impacts. And so it's actually, both papers are very clear that captivity has serious impacts on the survivorship of whales when they're in captivity. Somebody's asking what an ideal sanctuary would look like. And I think that's a really good question, because we have never done this before. We're working very hard on making such a sanctuary come into effect. We're trying to make it reality. But we're sort of working with new concepts and new ideas. The idea of building a sea pen to hold captive cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises, is established. There's lots of sea pen facilities around the world that hold public display cetaceans. But to design something that is bigger and not for public display, but for the welfare of the animals, purely for the welfare of the animals, is a challenge. We want something bigger than the typical sea pen enclosure. And the bigger it is, the less control you have over the animals, the more choices they have, which is what we want to give them. But that could be a husbandry challenge for the human caretakers. Because again, I don't think very many of these animals are good candidates for release. Maybe they could be released one day, and I certainly hope that one day some of them could be released one day. But our first priority is to provide them with something that can maintain them for a lifetime. And the larger the space, the more challenging it will be to care for them, because they're going to have more control over their lives. So the more control is great for them, challenging for us. We're working on that, and we are hoping to draw from the expertise of a lot of different experts, veterinarians, engineers, to come up with something that works for everybody, including the animals. We are trying to provide them with a sanctuary, a retirement situation, where they don't have to perform all the time, where they're not bred. That's the main thing. we're going to stop the breeding program so that those whales will live out their lives in greater comfort, greater control over their life, and then when they die, they will be the last. We won't be replacing them because the whole point of this isn't to entertain people. Now, what will become of those sanctuaries once all the current whales die? Well, we think that they will continue to be a place where these animals can come and when they're stranded or come ashore, and we hope that they can be rehabilitated, rescued, rehabilitated, and returned to the wild from these sanctuaries. So they would still have a purpose, but it would be different than a retirement facility once all of the current captive population has passed on. So finally, conservation. As I said, I did want to mention some of these issues that are related to the purpose of this series of webinars. This is a biodiversity webinar, and so I wanted to make clear that there are some conservation impacts. So CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, has the requirement that when you trade in these animals, live trade in these animals, you have to show that you are not harming, that there's no detriment to the populations from which these animals come. So this is about wild captures now, and these are still going on all around the world, unfortunately. And so we've got dolphins of various species, including orcas, being captured from the wild for the public display industry. And so CITES requires that you have to show that that trade is not harming the species. Unfortunately, although a non-detriment finding is supposed to be based on science, it usually isn't. It's usually just one government saying, hey, everything's fine. And it's not actually based on science. And this is a real problem for not just the welfare of the animals that are taken and put into captivity, but for their populations and their families that are left behind. If those families are being impacted in the wild from those removals, if there's no science behind the non-detriment finding, then it's just wishful thinking. And that is a very big problem from a conservation perspective. So the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is one of the most preeminent conservation organizations in the world, has pointed out that live captures, where you're not trying to kill the animal, you want to capture it alive and put it into a public display facility, is nevertheless, from the animal's perspective, the wild population's perspective, equivalent to killing. Because as far as the animals that are left behind are concerned, their companion is gone, their family member is gone. As far as they're concerned, that family member is dead. Its genes are no longer contributing to the population. This is that's what makes it a conservation issue, that these species, orcas, bottlenose dolphins, Risso's dolphins, and belugas in particular, are still being captured from the wild at a fairly high rate. And that's having an impact, a conservation impact, on the animals that are left behind. So in fact, live capture can become a serious threat to local cetacean populations. In and of itself, it's not going to cause any species to go extinct, but it may cause the decline and depletion of local populations. So unless you know for a fact, and I mean for a scientific fact, that those removals are not having a conservation impact, then you are not just having a welfare impact, you may very well be having a conservation impact, and therefore the trade is a problem. It becomes an environmental conservation problem. Where are orca captures occurring? Well, we've got them all happening in Russia right now. They used to happen off of our coast here in the United States. They used to happen off of Iceland, up in Scandinavia. Now they're only happening in Russia. They are happening on the far east coast of Russia. So we had one in 2003. We had one in 2012. We had 7 in 2013. We had 2 more at least, possibly more, in 2014. We also had 3 more in 2015. So this is at least 13 and possibly 16 in the last 3 years alone. Well, 4 now that we're in 2016. This is very disturbing. We are making a lot of progress in the West in terms of improving the welfare of these animals and decreasing the number of these facilities holding them. But in the Far East, in China and in Russia, we are seeing an increase in these animals being caught from the wild. This was an activity that was dormant for years, and now it's suddenly been revived. This is all in the face of the blackfish effect. It's very strange to us here in the West to see this being revived in the Far East, but we need to address it And in fact, my organization, the Animal Welfare Institute, along with several other international organizations, has started a campaign in China to raise public awareness to try to control the trade in these live animals that are going into an incredible number of new facilities that are being built left, right, and center in China and being filled with belugas, bottlenose dolphins, orcas, rhesus dolphins, pilot whales, all from the wild because they haven't been able to breed them in captivity yet. There are three popular sources of information that I urge you all to see. One is Blackfish, and again, I've discussed this already, but it is an extremely compelling documentary. It is factual. Again, it's being told from the perspective of the filmmaker, as every documentary is, but she made a very powerful effort to make sure that the information contained in it is factual. A powerful effort to make sure that the information contained in it is factual. SeaWorld is really the only source of complaint and opposition to this film, and that again makes sense because they're featured in the film and they feel very defensive about it, but their opinion about it is not based in fact. Death at SeaWorld was a book that came out a year earlier than Blackfish, so in 2012. I'm featured in this book. My work is featured in this book, so if you're interested in that, please find Death at SeaWorld at your local bookstore or Amazon. It's by David Kirby. And then more recently, just last year, John Hargrove, who's featured in Blackfish, wrote a book about his experiences as a SeaWorld trainer over 12 years and a trainer at Marineland of Antibes in France over 2 years, called Beneath the Surface. And that book also is available, of course, from Amazon or your local bookstore. The two books and the film are really excellent popular sources of information on what I've been discussing. Question about how they transport these animals. That's a really good question. It's not easy. It's very stressful. These are huge animals, and what they do is they put them in a sling with holes for their pectoral fins, and they lift them out with a crane, and they put them in a box that's the same size as they are, so it's no bigger than they are, and it's half filled with water to keep them cool because they can easily overheat, and to allow them some buoyancy because they're such large animals. And they put them on a truck and then on a plane, and they ship them wherever. This is not natural for the animals to be out of the water like this. The noise must be tremendous. The sounds of plane engines in the hold must be horrible for them. It's a very stressful process. So this is not something we encourage. If we do move these animals to sea pen sanctuaries, obviously they will need to be transported. That process will not be without risk. But we hope that by taking them to a sea pen instead of another concrete tank, that they will adjust far more easily and recover far more easily from the process. But believe me, we recognize that moving these animals, even if it's to a sea pen sanctuary, is not without risk. What is stopping the release of the orcas and other aquatic mammals in SeaWorld if this is so wrong? Politics, inertia, conventional wisdom. They have a lot of political influence. They have the strength of inertia in their favor. I mean, this has been considered to be a positive and educational and conservation-based activity for the past 50 years. Why is it suddenly different? It isn't suddenly different. It was never any of those things. It was always about entertainment. It was always about profit and capitalism and commercialism. But they were very good at marketing their product. And for 45 years, the opposition, which has always been there, I've been working on this issue, as I said, for 23 years, has been sidelined and has had a very small voice. But with the death of the trainer in February of 2010, the curtain was pulled back. A lot of insider information was exposed, and suddenly, with these popular Blackfish, Death at SeaWorld, Beneath the Surface sources of information, the public started learning what I've known for my entire career. So it's not so much that everything's changed in terms of what's behind all of this, it's that it's now been exposed in a way that is accessible to the general public. I've been saying the same message for 23 years, but nobody heard me until Don Brancho was killed. Sometimes it takes a tragedy like that to shift the conversation. I also did a TED Talk. The YouTube link is at the top there. It's kind of complicated there, so I don't know. You can just Google Naomi Rose, TEDx talk, Shamu, and it'll probably come up. It is obviously a TED talk is short, so it's only about, I think, 14 minutes long at the most. And it basically discusses the family structure of these whales and why it is so cruel to break up those family bonds as husbandry management tend to do in captivity. For orcas, I think that's the number one problem with captivity. The family structure of this animal, which is extremely complicated and sophisticated, is not honored in captivity. It is manipulated, broken, and ignored in captivity for husbandry management purposes. And it has a very serious impact on the animal's welfare. So that's it. I'm going to try to address a few more of these questions, and please ask more now that I'm done with the presentation. I can answer all the questions. I'm going to get back to I'm going to answer this question in a moment, but I'm going to get back to the point about what's going on right now. What we've got going on right now is 3 bills have been introduced. 2 state legislatures are considering bills, and the Congress, the federal Congress, is considering a bill. And then we also have some regulatory activities going on. So the 2 state bills, there's a bill that's been introduced in Washington State. Washington State currently has no captive cetaceans. So you may ask, why are they introducing a bill to ban the captive display of cetaceans? Well, because that was where all the captures took place back in the 60s and the 70s. Washington State was the ground zero for capturing orcas back in the 1960s and 1970s. An entire generation of southern residents was removed during those years, which is one of the reasons they are endangered today. The southern residents in the Pacific Northwest of the United States are now listed under the Endangered Species Act. And one of the main reasons for that is because they were decimated back in the 60s and 70s for the public display industry. And so this bill is basically having Washington State come full circle and take a position that they are never going to allow that to happen again. So that bill, HB 2888, was just introduced in January, and it has just passed the House of the Washington legislature, and it is now going to the Senate. So this is very exciting. It's the first time this bill has moved like that. It was introduced last year and didn't go anywhere, but this year it has really great prospects. So we are hoping that the Senate also passes it, and then it would go to the governor for signature. There's a bill in California. This bill would be, was introduced in 2013 first, which was by, 2014. I'm getting my years mixed up. It was first introduced in 2014 by Assemblyman Richard Bloom, and it would ban the public display of orcas only, not all cetaceans, just orcas. It would have a huge impact on SeaWorld of San Diego because there are 11 orcas at SeaWorld San Diego. So what this bill would do would be to make those 11 orcas the last 11 orcas ever on display in California. It would ban the breeding, it would ban the import and export into the state, and it would also ban the performances because they're just circus shows, and it's not an appropriate way to educate people about these magnificent animals. Believe me, those shows do not do justice to these animals. And so what it would do would be move this whole debate into an entire different arena if this bill passes. It will be reintroduced this year. So it was first introduced in 2014. There was no movement in 2015. It's going to be reintroduced in 2016. And we will see what happens this time, because certainly what's happening in Washington State is very encouraging in terms of trying to foresee what might happen in California. And then there's a national bill. There's a federal bill in the U.S. Congress. Representative Adam Schiff, who is a California politician, he has introduced H.R. 4019, the Orca Act. The acronym is the Orca Responsibility and Care Advancement Act. And this bill will, as similarly to the California bill, will only prohibit the public display of orcas. But it would have an impact on all of the facilities that display orcas, not just SeaWorld San Diego, but SeaWorld Orlando, SeaWorld San Antonio, and the Miami Seaquarium. So it is an amazing thing to have such a champion. It has several co-sponsors, including Representative Jared Huffman, and we would like to thank all of them for their tremendous support. This is something that we couldn't have done just 6 years ago. There would have been no political will for such a bill just 6 years ago. But ever since the blackfish effect, we now have serious movement in terms of the concern that politicians are starting to feel for this species being held in captivity. The regulatory effort that's currently underway is for the past 14 years, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is the agency responsible for the care and maintenance conditions under which these animals are kept. So they're the ones responsible, that agency, APHIS as we call it, APHIS, is responsible for those standards that allow Lolita to be kept in such a small tank, for example. They're finally updating those standards. And so that's a public process, and that's a process that we all as citizens can weigh in on. The public comment period is open, and if anybody's interested in that process, I urge you to go to my Facebook page, From the Dolphins' Point of View. If you're on Facebook, that is my community page, From the Dolphins' Point of View. And I am constantly updating the regulatory and legislative processes that are underway. Somebody's asking, what can students do? Well, I'll tell you something. There was a student in California who, she was only 10 years old at the time, and she actually got her school, one, to stop taking field trips to SeaWorld San Diego, and two, she got her local municipality, which was Malibu, to pass a resolution supporting the freedom of cetaceans and opposing their captivity. So you, as a student, you can go to your mayor, you can go to your town council, and you can try to get them to pass such resolutions. You could even try to get a bill passed in the legislature. That's a big deal. The one in Washington, HB 2888, that bill was introduced by a citizen, not a student, but nevertheless, she was just a regular citizen of Washington State. And she went to her legislators and she got them to promote and introduce this bill. Everybody has the power to do that. Whether you are an adult or not, believe me, politicians are very strongly affected when the children of their their electors, so the children of their constituents, when the students of those who elect them, the children of those who elect them, come to them and talk about these issues, that matters to them. That makes a big difference to them. So please do not think that just because you don't vote yet, that you don't have the power to influence politicians. You do. Another question. Somebody's saying that I often come under personal attack. I don't care. I know my worth. I know what I do. I know who my allies are, and I know what my background is. I know what my qualifications are. So when somebody attacks me personally, I look at that person and I say, who are you? And if I think there's somebody worth caring about, who I respect or whose own work I respect, well, then I'll consider that criticism and I'll take it under advisement. But if they're just somebody who has no expertise and loves SeaWorld and thinks that it's a positive thing to personally attack somebody instead of actually deal with the issues themselves, I don't even pay any attention to that. So it's not a matter of staying positive. It's really just I ignore it. It doesn't matter to me when somebody I don't respect doesn't respect me. That matters to me not at all. And I urge everybody, to think about it in those terms. If you respect somebody, then their opinion matters. If you don't respect somebody, why should their opinion matter to you? Have I ever wanted to stop advocating for animals? No, this is my full-time job. I'm not a volunteer. This is my day job. And I put a lot of effort into it because I believe in it. And I wish that for all of you students, that one day you have a job you believe in. It is a great joy. It's one of the reasons why I consider the argument that taking away the need for orcas and dolphins and whales and seals and sea lions and any other captive wildlife, taking away the need for them to do their job, which is to hunt for food and to survive in natural habitat. That's their job. Taking that away from them is not a positive. I would consider anybody coming to me and trying to take away my job to be totally wrong. And I would hate that because I love my job and I think what I do matters. And so, it's never occurred to me to give up. It's just not an option. So I'm still waiting for some new questions. I hope that I've answered what's going on legislatively and regulatorily satisfactorily. And in fact, it is 1:59, which means there's only 1 minute left. So if somebody else has one more question, I can take that. But other than that, I'll wrap things up and just say thank you all for tuning in. And I really enjoyed doing this type of webinar. And I hope that the National Biodiversity group asks me again for the coming years. And thank you all for tuning in. Bye, everybody. I have 1 more minute. Somebody just asked about how I